All right, it's time for us to begin this morning. If you want to go ahead and open up your Bibles to the book of Acts in chapter 27. We'll be reading, considering, and kind of walking our way through one of the last two chapters of the book of Acts for our study. And so before we do that, though, once you kind of get yourself situated and everyone's got their spot laid out just right, let's bow together in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day and the blessings that we share in Jesus. We hope that our heart opens to you fully, and as we seek your guidance, care, and comfort, that you abundantly protect us and provide for us. Help us to be encouragers and forgive us of our sins, and we pray this in your Son's name. Amen. All right, so right at the outset, a couple of quick reminder questions. With this part of the story of the Bible, and talking particularly about Paul's sailing here from his captivity in Caesarea Maritima to Rome, off the top of your head, what are some of the things that you remember of this story? What takes place? What helps you understand what's going on? You can cheat and look at your Bible, but try to remember it off the top of your head to your own benefit. So what comes to the top of your head? What takes place here? There's a couple of really familiar parts of the story. Shipwreck, right? There's the boat itself is going to be just wrecked. It's going to run aground. What else? Rich, you got something? Your hand went up to your glasses to resteady your brain. Yeah. That's the way it works. Yeah, when the brain goes on, the glasses kind of move around. My brain's not working, so. You got hit by a snake too. Right. There's an incident that, for some folks, actually creates a whole theological thread or a practical thread that they think that's an ongoing thing. They kind of attach to it that way. What else? Anything else off the top of your head? This is a way to remember these stories, is to kind of bring it to the top and realize you actually know quite a bit of what's going on without even reading the text.
Did he have a revelation that they would lose the ship but not life?
Correct. There's a divine component to an earthly event. Now let's back up for a second and kind of pay attention to this in a bigger sense. Are there any other biblical stories involving weather, shipwrecks, or God's prophets? This should be an easy one, right? You got a yes or no question. The answer is yes, right? I realize it's the first couple questions of the morning, and so the questions have to kind of pull us out of our slumber, not put us to sleep. And so these questions have to be that way. So, what's the first story you remember? What's our first shipwreck story involving a prophet and maybe some storms? Well, we got Jesus and asleep in the boat. But who else do we have? Jonah. Jonah's story involves a prophet of God going somewhere to testify concerning God's plan for them. It involves a serpent in it. Giant fish, Leviathan. We tend to think about it as a whale. Really, we just don't know what it is. It's a word that's obscure, and we translate it in different ways. But it just means big, waterborne creature. So whatever it is, it was large. Whatever it was able to take in him. And we also have, in that case, a reluctant prophet. He doesn't want to go. And he has to get bit by the serpent in order for him to end up where he needs to be. And that's a big bite. The whole thing gets chomped up. It's a way to remember it. Okay, so now we have another one that Shirley brought up involving Jesus upon a vessel. In this case, it's a freshwater fish context in the Sea of Galilee. And there, Jesus has a couple of stories involving him on sailing vessels, some involving fishing that aren't really stormy, but others do have the tumultuous storms. It involves Peter walking upon the water and then not. It has Jesus moving by and walking out there as well in one of those stories, intending just to pass them by. Instead, he doesn't, kind of alluding to the way in which God passes by Israel a couple times. So these are not surprising things to a degree in the sense of the region has these stories. We understand the intrigue and the difficulty of a seafaring story. We can quickly connect to it. Like all the Bible stories, they're not so far-fetched that we can't understand them. There are ones that have our grounding in practical reality. We go, this is a big deal. We're all on this vessel, and we all know how it could go. And if that vessel goes down, everyone goes down with the ship. No one's going to come to save them. And so we know that, and we kind of see that. But we're also familiar with God's work in the past. And so when a story like this occurs, involving God's people, and we're reading a message that's intended to explain God's work, we do what we've done. We begin to look for, where is God in this story? What is Luke trying to tell us in what looks like a first-person perspective, the way he writes it, about what's going on here? What were we supposed to gather? And they are threatened by both the storm and the shipwreck. But Paul's presence there creates a thread of salvation for not just Paul, but every life, if, and Shirley's kind of point connects to this as well, they will listen. If they're paying attention. And if they will actually follow through. That's different, by the way, than our story involving Jonah. In Jonah's case, Jonah doesn't want to have a thing to do with them. And it's the sailors who come to him and say, hey, what's going on here? So there's some interesting turns that take place in these similar stories that will produce, perhaps, in some ways, a way for us to remember this in a larger way. All right, so backstory. The story before this, Paul's innocence has been affirmed publicly, but he is still bound by his request to go to Rome. The audience he had before, the rulers that were now in power, said, well, had he not appealed to Rome, I would have set him free. And his message that he had preached before that talked about his conversion, his commitment, and his desire. His desire was that everyone be as he is, except for these chains. Which sets us up for the end of the book, by the way, just to kind of reveal the ending. The book ends in part with Paul enchained, but the gospel is unchained. And that's kind of how the book of Acts closes, if you will. All right, so now let's get a little closer into the text. We have a big overview. We've kind of looked at that. Verses 1 through, say, 12 or so, and even verses 1 through 8, we find that Paul is not going to be journeying in some special contingent at this case. His journeys from Jerusalem to Caesarea had been in hand-carried context with soldiers there to protect him from the Jews who wanted him to die. This time now, if you notice in the text, he is going to be entrusted to Julius and Paul and some other prisoners. We don't get to get all the details, but we do begin to see that Paul is now in a grouping of people. And the dialogue here has shifted to, I don't know if you noticed it, that Luke is with him. It shifts to that we should sail for Italy. That's something to think about. Because remember, the book begins, just like the Gospel of Luke begins, with this statement, I am going to carefully investigate. I have carefully considered all the things that happened, first pertaining to Jesus, and second pertaining to the disciples, to accurately explain to Theophilus. And Luke goes back and forth from they to we. So here we have the return again of a we. So in some way or another, Luke is now going to be able to be with him. We will sail in this way. And we don't know how that's taken place. We don't have a clear understanding as to how that's allowed, other than the text has already indicated to us that Paul was able to receive guests and visitors, even though he was in prison. And that practice seems to have continued upon his arrival to Rome. And so, to some degree or another, you have an instance here where Paul is able to be supported in new ways, though he himself is a prisoner. They go on their journey. They finally find around verse 6. There the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty at Cnidus, as the wind was not allowing us to go farther. And we sailed under the lee of Crete off of Salome, coasting along it with difficulty. We came to a place called Fair Havens in the ESV, near which was the city of Lasea. Then they have to wait again. The voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over. Paul advised them, saying, "Sirs, I perceive the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. Kind of a little bit of a storytelling, ominous, hey, it's not a great idea, and a divide of understanding. The ESV has it, the majority decided, in the way that this text lays out. Can't recall what the translation is for the New American Standard. I know it's very similar. But you think about this. On a practical level, the ship owner and the pilot should know more about sailing upon this part of the ocean than Paul would, right? What's Paul's profession, by the way? Do you remember that? Tent maker. You know what tent makers also made? Sails, right? It's the same skill set. Doesn't mean Paul's a sailor, because that's a different skill and discipline. But it shows us that Paul's craft was not as limited as we sometimes think it is. And now Paul also potentially, although it does not explicitly say, has additional insight. Here at this point in the text, it doesn't tell us how he knows what he knows. It just says, I perceive. I can see that if we leave, it's not going to go good. And that's not really surprising, because this is dealing with what we would consider common knowledge in the area and in the context of the world. Let me rephrase it this way. We all know certain things simply because that's the way it works. And this is the easiest one for all of us to know. At the end of winter, why is this part of Georgia yellow? Pollen, right? We all know that. If you lived here for a little bit, it's like one of the first lessons you learn in our first spring. And I think Atlanta in this area has like 6 different springs. Like first spring, next spring, fake spring. But we know that. The yellow happens out, and we also know what that does to everything. One, that means the plants are going to start producing, the flowers will start appearing, etc., etc. There'll be some stages, but we all know. It's common knowledge. Just a little bit of experience. Well, in this area, in this region, and in this context of the world, knowing the weather around all of the seafaring zones was common knowledge. And everyone kind of knows. You just don't do that. The risk is never worth the reward because so many ships are lost at sea. And how do we kind of think about that? Well, realize this. They constantly keep pulling out from various seafaring harbors in these regions the remains of ships that were lost at sea. The very fact that we actually have what's called the Jesus boat, which isn't really his boat, but a fishing boat that was found in Galilee is because it was lost at sea, in this case the Sea of Galilee, and they extracted it when the water level dropped down one year. Like, oh, we found it. We pulled it up. That's a normal thing. It kind of helps us understand that everyone realized this was the normal case. And so Paul's perspective should not be limited in either direction. Should not be limited to earthly knowledge, because the majority doesn't mean everyone but Paul. It means the majority. And it should not be limited to say, well, no, it was all personal knowledge. No, God's hand is involved in Paul's journey too. Both of those things are legitimately ideas that have to be held in our hands. And the second one makes sense when combined with what happens next. So he can certainly have known this, and others certainly would have too. But Paul is being given extra information down the road that will be helpful to them, that counters what he says here. Because what he said here is, hey, if we go, everyone will be lost. Your ship, your cargo, and all lives. And so kind of keep that in the back of your mind as you're thinking about what happens next. Les, could you read a little bit for me? Verses 13 through 20 right now of chapter 27.
Now when the south wind blew gently, supposing they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along the creek close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind, called a northeaster, struck down from the land, and when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along, running under the lee of a small island called Cauda. We managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship, and fearing that they would run aground on Syrtis, they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. And neither sun nor star appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us. All hope of our being saved was at last abandoned.
So imagine, if you will, use your own imagination, all that storm information going on. The clouds darkening, the rain is constant, the gale force wind, translated as the nor'easter in a lot of our translations, is battering this vessel so hard. Their first thing is, we have our ship's boat, which trails behind us, that we tow so we can go in and out to port. That's going to cause some problems, and the point that it's going to start battering against us. It's going to destroy itself or us. And then, due to the style of design of the boats of that day, they pull that in, it's secured, and then they take ropes to lay them underneath the boat. They do that to tighten up all the gaps, because as that boat does this and it racks back and forth, the expanded seam joints of a sailing vessel of that era, well, they're no longer in close contact. And you know what happens to a boat that has cracks in it? Start leaking. It's like trying to get on the lake and starting up your boat and saying, oh, I forgot to put the plug in. It's like, oh, you're going down. And so this boat will rack unless they undergird it. And they strap it in with ropes, big braided ropes, to tighten it back up. Now that could cause greater damage to the boat down the road, but the option are do that now, or don't do that, and we're going to definitely sink. And there's that much pressure being built up, so they tighten up the boat, and then they begin to jettison things that are causing us to sit lower in the water. How many of you have ever rowed a boat, gotten in a small sailboat, paddled a canoe or a kayak? How many of you guys have done that? Les and I get to raise our hand, I know for sure. David's done that, a few others, right? When you get into the boat, what does it do? Does it just stay exactly as it is? It tips a little bit, and then, depending on all kinds of physics involving water displacement, the size of the boat and the vessel, it always kind of drops a little bit.
The size of the person in it?
Hey, now. That's a little too personal. Yes, when I get into a vessel, it sinks, but I'm also tall, and it kind of also lifts to one side for a little bit, too. And I got to make sure I'm centered, because I might lift a little too far to one side of the back. So that all happens. Well, that's happening because of the cargo. And the draft line of the boat gets closer and closer to the bottom, and it's fine when there's no winds. It's fine when the winds are in your favor. But if you're tipping and it's a storm, you would much rather raise that little line, the draft line of the boat, go up a little higher. So as they jettison stuff, they're making the boat lighter. Yes, they'll toss around more, but they won't be in danger of swamping the boat on either side. So much so that after the cargo gets jettisoned, now they're like, we got to get this tackle out of here. Now, you understand, that's the livelihood they're throwing away. They're throwing away profit first, the cargo, livelihood second. Now they're beginning to see how serious this can and will be. In essence, they're just hoping that if they strap themselves to the boat, they'll make it. And maybe the boat will stay afloat. And they themselves will somehow make it out. Now it says, since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of God, of the God to whom I belong, and whom I worship. And he said, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island. Running aground in any kind of seafaring vessel isn't a pleasant experience. It is the equivalent of being in an auto accident, except you may not be strapped in, and the vessel itself is going to start tearing apart. When that happens, because you're in a storm, an accident is over when the vehicles lose their stored dynamic energy. That's now moved into kinetic energy. Well, in this case, the vessel will hit ground, and that event will be over. The storm didn't go away, and the ocean doesn't go away. It's going to continue to smoosh, it's a technical term, that boat up against the rocks. And by the way, it happens anytime there's water hydraulics taking place. If you've ever seen a canoe that came out of the water and all of a sudden it looks like it's a big C shape, that's because somehow or another it got rounded around a tree or a rock. And that hydraulic just kind of takes it under. Well, that happens to seafaring vessels, but they fall apart. They're torn apart. They're ripped asunder. And that's where a lot of lives are lost instantly. Because as much force it takes to tear apart a wood-clad vessel, think what it does to the human form. And so their fears, which were here, then they were here. Paul's identifying and saying, you know they should be here, but God has said they should be here. That's a powerful moment of testimony for Paul as he says, the God whom I worship and the God to whom I belong. In the context of their world, gods of all types existed in some sort of conflict. And Paul is saying, I've been told you're going to be okay. My God has revealed this. When the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea about midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on, they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under the pretense of laying out anchors for the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. Some of the sailors were like, hey, we're going to lay out these anchors to make sure our vessel doesn't smash against the rocks. Paul is like, I know what they're up to. And again, this is one of those narrative bits where we are not told how Paul knows. Just, I know what they're up to. And he goes to the centurion and the soldiers and says, if they escape, we're done for. That centurion's behavior with Paul has shifted, right? Before it had been, hey, I don't think we should go on the vessel. I think if we go, the vessel, the cargo, and all lives will be lost. And now it's shifted to, if those guys get off this vessel, we're all done for. The centurion's like, cut it away. They're all staying with us. We are in for the penny, in for the pound, if you want to think of it in that idiom. As the day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength. For not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you. When he said these things, he took bread and, giving thanks to God, in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. And they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. Now we got some scale coming in. So initially we had seafaring vessel, strong, big enough that they could gird it underneath with ropes, which is something you do with a larger vessel. Has got a secondary ship to get back to shore when you have a more shallow port context. Now we have number 276 people is the numbering that I've got. I know there's a subnote about those details in some of the translations. That's a big vessel. Because it's a big vessel in the sense that this is not a rowed ship. It is presented to us as a sailing vessel. It doesn't mean they don't have oars and they wouldn't row, but it's not one that's exclusively designed to transit by oar and manpower. So there's a lot of people on here. We don't even know exactly how it breaks down, but if we got a centurion, that usually makes him a captain of 100, right? So our centurion is in charge of all the soldiers that will be underneath him, all the we, that is the prisoners, and the we, that is whoever is with Paul that may or may not also be a prisoner, all in transit to Rome, and all the sailors on the ship. So there's a lot at stake in loss of life. Now when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off from the anchors, left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes and tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But, striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow struck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. I'm sure individually you've all created a visualization of all of that, and that's part of the awesome way in which God tells us the story. You can kind of see all that taking place. You can visualize what's taking heart there. But I also kind of catch this detail that the centurion now is deeply concerned with keeping Paul alive. It's irrational to a degree in that the other soldiers' behavior is legitimate within the context of their rules. We can't let these soldiers, these prisoners of various kinds, escape. If they escape, we're accountable. The centurion is willing to take all that risk to himself to save Paul. And we're never really fleshed out up to this point as to why Paul is now so important to him. Other than the fact that he's a Roman citizen, he has appealed to Caesar, and now he is demonstrating a connection to divinity that is unlike what would have been normal in this man's life. So there's more going on there as well. We got a little bit more of the text that we can read here in a second, but before we do that, what are your observations up to this point? We've got 10 more verses in our reading plan for today. What kind of observations do you have about what's taking place? Details you noticed? Or questions?
Well, one thing that I noticed at the very beginning was they knew they were going to have to spend the winter somewhere. They weren't going to be able to make it on to Italy. And they knew they were taking a chance because they didn't like the harbor that they were in. They wanted a more suitable harbor.
Yeah.
So they knew they were taking a chance to start with. And they knew that they were going to have to spend the winter somewhere.
Yeah, like this is like they already kind of recognize, and this harbor wasn't suitable, and a suitable harbor is a big deal for a big vessel. This is a larger ship. If the harbor is not big enough, then the ship itself is at risk. Through all these seasons of storms that tear it up here, it could have been in their minds torn up there. What else? Anything else you noticed in the reading of this part of Paul's life, Gary?
Right now, I have no idea where they are.
Yeah, there's like it's some island. Like they don't know where, and they could be with the way the storms work and the cycle of the currents in this part of the world. Anything in that entire larger Middle Eastern region is a possibility. They could be landing somewhere where Romans aren't welcome. So the soldiers' concerns could be in that area. They could be landing somewhere where there's no food. There's no protection for them. We don't know any of those things. We just know that now they've gone from absolute darkness, not able to discern between day and night for what looks to be 14 days, to now they see day, but the only thing they really see is they think land is there, and they start dropping these soundings. Like let's drop basically like we're going to drop a rock and see how long it takes to get to the bottom. And listen and work through that and say, okay, well, yeah, it's just, okay, we're definitely getting closer to land because the distance shrinks. But then they're like, wait a minute, we're closer to land, the ship's going to hit because it's a large vessel. And so this is all making the complications. What else? Anything else that you noticed?
I think piling onto that, right? So because there's no sun, there's no stars, there's no navigation.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, you're literally being tossed wherever the wind is taking you to. And the fact that they've been without food for 2 weeks, which I guess makes sense. That just gives you an idea of just how violent that boat was being tossed.
Yeah.
Pretty much everybody just like hanging on.
Yeah, if you've ever watched any kind of nautical movie that tries to dramatize a shipwreck, you could easily think about, well, maybe they're strapping themselves to the boat itself, or they're down inside the cabin, or they're up as high as they can, trying to get away from the rocks. All those are possible because there's so many of them there. All that's in the space of possibilities. From there, they're all safely on land. The text continues. After we, again, they said that pronoun comes back in, brought safely through, we then learned that the island was called Malta. The native people showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and welcomed us all, because it had begun to rain and was cold. When Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. When the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "No doubt this man is a murderer. Though he has escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." However, he shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. They were waiting for him to swell up and suddenly fall down dead. But when they had waited a long time and saw no misfortune come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. Now in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the chief man of the island named Publius, who received us and entertained us hospitality for 3 days. It happened that the father of Publius lay sick with fever and dysentery, and Paul visited him and prayed, putting his hands on him, and healed him. And when this had taken place, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured. They also honored us greatly. And when we were about to sail, they put on board whatever we needed. So there's a couple of amazing outcomes from the earthly side take place in this last section, but this is the story of Paul being bit by our serpent, our viper, and Paul's response to it is pretty, like, this is not a big deal. Like, he shakes it off and goes about his business. And all the islanders are like, well, let's just, we know what this looks like. And I love the narrative here. Luke's part of it gives us insight into their perception. Clearly, this guy's guilty of something because he just survived a shipwreck. And the first thing that happens to him while we're making him a fire is he gets bit by what they all know is a poisonous creature. And that bite should just straight up very soon cause him to swell up and die. And they're just like, okay, justice is about to be met out. And then they're waiting. And then they're still waiting. And then they're still waiting. Now their mind begins to shift and go, well, if he's not a murderer and he survived the shipwreck and he just survived the viper, he's a god. In a relative experiential sense, it's pretty rational. Because those two things shouldn't happen. Now, they don't realize there's a third option, that the God whom he serves protects him. Or they don't express it. But either way, that's their outcome. And then the next thing Paul ends up doing is now healing those who are sick. He is attached now to a story of God's divinity on that island, but also beyond that, that really expands how we see Paul at this point and how they do as well. And the centurion and the soldiers and the sailors are all present for all of it. Oh, and in the end, they give them everything they need. Whatever we needed, they just put it on board and give it to us. They took care of them. And on the providential side, we see it that way because that's God taking care of them too. God's providence is explored and explained. And really, I will suggest to you that when we think about the direct providential care of God, this story is a great way to understand it. The concept of providence is a difficult principle to understand as a disciple, right? Because you don't really have a sense of knowing when God is doing, because God's provision for us is so expansive. It goes from all creation to relationships to whatever his direct action is. In this story, we actually get all of those options. We get God's direct action. He speaks to Paul and says, do this. If everyone stays on the ship, everyone lives. We get God's relational care. You have the centurion who now has a relationship with Paul, willing to serve in concert with Paul. You have God's direct action again with the bundle of sticks and the viper that comes out to bite on Paul. And Paul does not die. God's direct action again helping the islanders. He helps them independent of their faith, but dependent upon Paul's. And then they provide to Paul and the rest of the travelers, prisoners, sailors, and soldiers alike, and giving them everything they need. And so you have a full circle of all the possibilities. If there's an option on the wheel of providence, you can spin it and find it in this story. The advantage for us is to think about it that way, rather than pondering the intricacies of trying to figure out, did God give me providential care? Because the answer is almost always yes. That yes, chance happens, but yes, God also cares in the heart of chance. And happen, by the way, the interesting root of the word happened, which is hap, means chance. So things that happened, it's a root word that says chance. So anyway, that's really what's going on there. We're seeing all those things play out. We're seeing God's work. Paul the prisoner becomes Paul the captain. Basically running the ship to its salvation. And then in the end, Paul is serving in some ways as an illustration or a type that Christ himself is the full magnification of. Paul is healing the lame and the sick by the power of God. Paul is unaffected by the cares and whims of the world. Paul is living in a new space and way and different steps. And so Paul is shown to us to not be divine, but to certainly have divine endorsement. I'll also note that we've kind of seen this too, and Les hinted at it a little bit. There are consequences to the greed of the sailors and their distortion of sense of self-preservation. Oh, we can't weather here in this bad port. We've got to get to a good port, or it's a better place for us to weather. And our lives will risk it. And your sailors' lives will risk it. And your centurion lives will risk it. All these prisoners' lives, they don't count for anything anyway, or risk that. And in so doing, they could have lost their lives, and almost did a couple times. And they still lost everything. They lost their vessel. They lost all the cargo. Had they stayed in port, cargo could have been offloaded. The ship would have had its outcome by whatever means would have happened. Questions, thoughts, things that you noticed in our reading this week, or principles that are important?
I appreciate the amount of detail. I mean, that's being shared with us.
Yeah.
The amount of detail that's going through all of this particular journey. And as you think about it, you're kind of saying, what does this mean for me, right? Paul obviously was on a mission that God had sent him on. And maybe it's about us. Maybe how does that apply to us as far as our lives, and what are we doing on a daily basis?
Yeah. And the detail that's included here is interesting on two levels. One level from that is that we don't always get a lot of detail. Some of the stories involving Paul in particular are very short. Paul did this thing, this certainly interesting and sometimes amazing thing happened, and he did the next thing. But remember that the audience to which surrounds the story of God's people in the first century, sailing and nautical stuff is part of their life. It's normal for them. As much as it is normal for them to be shepherds and farmers. They are also all involved in sailing. How many of them were fishermen? How many of their livelihood is based on the ability to provide food for them from the sea and from the streams and the rivers and also from the oceans? And so this is also something that would resonate with them in ways just like it does for us. And none of us are true sailors, right? We may have experience, but we're not running the mast up, we're not running up the sail every day, even though there's part of us that maybe wants to have that adventure. But we resonate with it just like they did. All right, that's it for our time for this morning. We'll be back in the book of Acts in chapter 28 and verse 11 next Sunday. Thanks, everybody.